So as they're getting settled, I know that the previous session, as I mentioned earlier, talked a little bit about security and privacy. So we've got plenty of time for questions here. What I'd like to do is, based on the topics that they all discussed earlier, ask a couple of questions to get the discussion started. But then we'll certainly open it up, and we'll have microphones that we can pass around as well. So thank you all again very much for speaking. It was really interesting. You all sort of touched on different aspects of it, and I think one thing I like about this panel is we're sort of bringing in different perspectives to the security problem. So, John, maybe if I could start with you. There was something you'd mentioned about within the city and county of San Francisco. You sort of have adopted this team approach and sort of that model in operating in city government, and not so much, especially from a security perspective, have taken this top down and sort of mandating things, but sort of working collaboratively. So I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about how that's worked, specifically in the security space. I can see how that could work with a number of other agencies across the government, but how that's been beneficial in terms of addressing a number of the threats that your city faces every day, and implementing some of the solutions from a security standpoint.
Sure. Well, like I said, San Francisco is probably not unique, but it's a challenge in the sense that you have a lot of highly independently run and independently operated organizations. And so to be the chief information officer or the director of the central IT department and try to dictate policies or procedures or standards everyone's going to follow is probably not the most effective way to achieve a cohesive approach to security. And so some of the examples brought up about the parking meters being hacked, I can give you plenty of other examples. We had a server taken over at the PUC by a Chinese gaming company for gaming purposes, luckily. So I found out about that one because I got a letter in the mail one day saying, by the way, your personal information might have been exposed. A fun way for me to find out that our PUC had actually had a penetration event. But I think that the change in really the culture, and I will say this about cybersecurity and open government, is it's certainly a technological problem that we all face, and hearing about all the examples of how the attacks and threats are becoming more sophisticated, at the same time easier to launch, perhaps with toolkits online and things like that, it's certainly sobering. On the other hand, I think for us in San Francisco, the change has really been changing how we address them. It can't be a sort of top-down dictatorial approach to how we're going to achieve these things. First of all, I think we're having to accept that there's going to be some amount of events that happen that get through our defenses. And so first is to get past that sort of cultural internal barrier of sharing with each other when we have problems and being open about what those problems are, either from a security event or confidentiality breach, learning from that, and then really coming up with a team approach to doing it. We all have very small staffs. None of us have probably as large IT budget in terms of security or staffing that we'd like in each of our individual departments in government. So what we've had to do is we've reached out to the FBI over in Oakland, and we developed a relationship with them. We started meeting with a lot of the private industry companies that have better, frankly, security models than we do, and having very open sort of collaborative meetings internal to the city, and created these response teams and CERT teams. When we have a problem, we go in and we look at it, and we're very collaborative about, do we understand what happened, how are we going to prevent that from happening in other places in the cities, and really trying to take that on, because I think that's really part of the cultural change in government. Is we were always afraid to fail before, and we don't want to fail, but it's a reality that sometimes with technology in a very diverse, non-homogeneous ecosystem, you're going to have failures, you're going to have penetrations, and so how do you learn from that, and how do you change the culture of the organization so that every failure becomes something that you can learn from and make the system stronger from in the future? So that's really our approach in San Francisco now.
Thank you. Pascal, you talked a little bit earlier about, in your talk, about some of these key business drivers for ensuring adequate investment in cybersecurity in this sort of smart grid concept. So you kind of addressed what some of those drivers are. I was wondering if you had some thoughts on how you quantify or do some sort of cost-benefit analysis, especially sort of as a large utility, sort of thinking about where to make investments or where others might make investments, how you address that.
Yeah, thank you. Well, that's a tough question. In fact, it's usually very difficult to put figures on cybersecurity. What we try to address here is to use a risk management techniques and methodology to address this question of what is a return on an investment. So basically, what Galen mentioned. I think we use different methods. The first one is to work together with one person from the, let's say, the functional aspects or the business aspects, and one person on the more cybersecurity type of experience. And when we make those two peoples work together, usually we achieve to perform a very efficient risk management assessment. So that's one of the way we address the problem. Another way is to look at what consequences could happen, for example, from a failure or from an attack. And usually, if we find something that has a high impact, usually it means that we have to put a high attention on these aspects. So even if there is a very small probability of an attack to happen, if it have a huge consequence, we need to take care of this kind of aspects. So, well, to answer your question, it's very difficult to put real figures, but we still have the risk management methodology to ensure that our approach is consistent with our missions and with the threats.
Thank you. Galen, I liked your list of the trends impacting security that you mentioned. I was wondering if you could share a little bit about your thoughts, sort of given the discussion the last 2 days about sort of what smart city means. Which of those do you think most affect the security challenges or securing a smart city like infrastructure and environment and so forth?
Right. I think one of the biggest challenges is going to be having the potential of millions of new devices and sensors that are put out in the field. Even if you have millions, let's say you have 10,000 devices that are put out in the field. For those devices, you can't spend a lot of money on physical protection for those devices. There's a good chance that somebody will be able to reach out and touch those devices. So it's not quite the same as, for example, building a large substation, putting a fence around it, and having somebody maybe stationed at a control house, for example, or something like that, right? You can have, for example, you already have meters on the side of your house. If you look on different poles, a lot of times you can find equipment for your distribution system. And maybe it's in a case, so it isn't a metal case, but it has a little lock on it. And I don't know how you feel about having little locks on boxes, but they don't make me feel terribly secure. And if you were to open that up, there's a good chance you would find in there a device with the radio. It could have different COM ports on it, engineering ports on it, debug ports on it, things like that, ways that you can plug into that system. So, and to me, that's also what makes this such a unique problem to solve, and a departure from the more traditional IT security issues, is that you have this problem of physical protection and physical attacks on devices. And to deploy the number of sensors and IEDs and actuators that you want to actually make large systems work, there's no way that you can invest a lot of money in those devices. And so the question is, how do you architect a system assuming that any particular device will be compromised, right? So it has to be your going-in assumption when you design that somebody could compromise a particular device. At some point, you might not be able to trust data coming from that device, for example, or that device might be somebody might attempt to use that device to attack other devices or other parts of the system. And so I think when you look at a smart city, that I would say presents one of the bigger challenges. And you can't overcome it by doing the good risk management, and as I said, you can develop architectures that allow any particular device to be or owned, but it certainly presents a big challenge.
Right. Definitely increases the attack surface,
Yes.
as you talked about.
Yep,
I mean, this is a
that's
whole
right.
different dimension. Are there, maybe to follow up on that just quickly, so John, are there some things, as a municipality, when you're talking about deploying some of these devices within a city or on city property or having to work with, deploying them on commercial property, are there some things that can be done to help kind of reduce that, minimize that attack surface? I mean, you still have to kind of take into account what Galen said, that if one of these is taken over, you've got to account for that. But are there some things, as you were thinking about how we would deploy all of these sensors that could be?
Well, I think to my fellow panelists' point, one is to build in that security element up front. I mean, a lot of times we rush into deploying things without any really thought to security before we deploy them. It's very easy to buy devices and plug devices in. And I hate to be the unenthusiastic person in meetings sometimes, but when I go to these meetings and someone said, "Hey, we just got a grant for XYZ and we're going to plug all this stuff in," there hasn't been a whole lot of thought to what does that mean to the system and how's it going to work. And then to the second point, I think there has to be acknowledgement that at some point some smart person or persons are going to figure out how to hack the system. And so then I think you always have to have a plan B, so to speak. You have to know when you have been hacked or when the systems have been penetrated. So I think we tend to spend a lot of time and energy in government really hardening the perimeter, but once the perimeter has been pierced, then it's just wide open. Then all our defenses are down. We don't really seem to have thought through the second or third level of defense. And so I think building in those requirements or that thought process into how are we going to secure the new things we plug into the device, or when we create these integration points, how are we going to secure that? I think that's the cultural shift I was talking about. Is just getting people to think about that up front is an important step, because I think if you think about that, there are some basic things you can do to make things more secure. Then I think where we're spending a lot more time really is on that second and third layer of defense, where instead of spending all our energy on that first line of defense, we're starting to think about what our fallback positions are and how we can sort of compartmentalize our risk in different areas, so that if something is hacked or penetrated, we're going to know when it happened and really minimize the risk to the rest of the system.
Great. Thanks. Should we take questions? Okay. If anybody in the audience has questions, the microphones we can pass over.
Hi, my name is Olivier. The CEO of Duke Energy spoke at a conference in Stanford in June, and contrary to what you're presenting, which is cybersecurity is a problem to solve from the growing trend of smart grids, he actually turned things around and said actually cybersecurity is going to be a main driver for smart grids and microgrids. Could you talk about that, and whether it's it's too late, the cat is out of the bag and we're going to have to fix it, or it's a false chicken and egg problem?
That's an interesting perspective. So can you give an example of what you mean? Like when you say that cybersecurity is supposed to be a driver for smart grid in
Sure.
what way?
Probably last week is a good example. He was talking about the fact that in a centralized electric system, if you have a failure, instead of being localized, it could trigger a massive power blackout through a large region. And so he was promoting islands of interconnected microgrids as a resiliency to cyber security, cyber attacks.
I see. So you're saying that, that the introduction of some smart grid technologies can make the grid more resilient, and that should be a driver for deploying those technologies. And it wouldn't necessarily be just a cybersecurity attack then, right? It could be from any of these threats. But the idea is that you actually are increasing the resiliency of the grid by being able to support things like islanding and microgrids. And I think you're right, that's an under-discussed point and advantage, I think, of deploying technologies like microgrids, for example. And so, but at the same time, I don't think I could use that perspective for all smart grid technologies. But you're right, there are some key technologies that can, I think, overall increase the resiliency of the grid. Do you have any comments, Pascal?
Yeah. Well, I think that could be useful what you just described, but we still have to understand that the power system, like it is right now, is already kind of resilient. I mean, there are already lots of interconnections, especially in Europe, interconnection on the transmission level. And so we are already able to identify where are the errors or the failures on the lines, and we are already able to isolate some bad networks in order not to have the cascading effect on the overall power systems. So we already, I think, have a rather good level of reliability on the electric power network. Probably we can do better. So we are open, of course, to any improvement on the reliability. Cyber security and IT, of course, could be of very useful technologies to support further methodologies or tools. Yeah.
Yeah. Two questions. Do you think experts have a good idea of how many virus or worm are active today but not detected? Are we talking about 10% or 90%? I have an idea myself, but I would like to hear experts on that. Really difficult point. Second question is, do you think it's difficult for companies to work on this kind of area when, in the same time, governmental agencies are paying for worm to infect other countries? That something that may be unlawful is supported by state government offices. Paul, from Smart Future, French company.
Okay, I can maybe try to... I will start with the second question. I think the cyber war, like we call it, is not recent. It starts maybe even before World War II, but at least during World War II, with the Enigma machines, you know, that were supposed to cipher the messages sent by the German people to the different field of operation. And there are lots of good work made by UK and US to decipher Enigma machines. And what could be interesting is I prefer to look at the positive way of saying. And what is interesting is that a historian estimates that the fact of being able to break the Enigma system we have won 2 years of war during the Second World War. And so IT security, I think there is no bad guys against good guys. I mean, it's more complex than this kind of thing. So my point here is that IT security could also be useful to avoid physical war. So, okay, that was my first answer to your second question. But I will let, of course, my colleagues complement. And about your first question, it's very difficult. Of course, I will not give a figure, but we are aware that some of the system could be infected, even during the time we just receive them from vendors. So I think the right way to address this issue is to have in-house test beds, in-house resources, in-house or shared. I mean, it could be collaborative test bed. That really makes sense. And to be able to assess independently of providers the level of security of the equipment, of systems that we use. I will let you know.
All right. Well, I don't have an answer to your first question either. I think we need McAfee or Symantec here at the table to give you a very definite number on that. And certainly the there are new forms of malware and viruses being developed all the time. So that's why blacklisting is actually a losing game in the long run. Not that whitelisting is that easy in practice either, but you're right. There's, I'm sure, an incredible amount of malware and zero-day exploits that we don't know about. I don't know what percentage that is, or how you would really estimate that there. Well, the second question, it's kind of interesting if you think about the amount of money that the utilities invest in security, and the potential threat from, say, a nation-state attack. And I think that's part of why Stuxnet was such an eye-opener for people, because it's clearly very well funded. Development had gone on for, I think, at least 2 years. They had taken advantage of multiple zero-day exploits for Windows, as well as vulnerabilities and the control system software. They, at one point, had not one, but 2 certificates that they had subverted as part of that effort as well. And they knew a lot about the system they were attacking, down to the number of devices and the vendors, so they had some type of inside knowledge of that, or some way of getting inside the perimeter of a very physically secure facility. So I'm sure there are a lot of operatives involved in that as well, in terms of people. So if somebody actually directs that level of resources at you and you're a utility, there's not much you're going to be able to do, I think, because it's cost prohibitive to try and defend against that level of attack. So you can work on the low-hanging fruit and hit the medium level and train your people, create a culture of security, have good physical protection as well, but that type of focused attack would be very, very difficult for a company to defend against.
So I'm curious, you said you had an opinion. What was
That's
your opinion?
great.
I think it's more than 50%.
150.
More than. Because those that are not detected are those that are
Smarter than the others. And that's the main reason.
Mm-hmm.
Other question?
Hi, Bruno with EDF and EPRI. I'd like to ask John what he thinks about the fact that I assume that you will have one day a real attack, a real failure, like the one you already mentioned. And are you already prepared to communicate on that? Are you already prepared to say, okay, we are sorry, but we failed in that? And so, because it's also, to me, a question of image. It's not only technical things, it's also, if you fail, for instance, in securing a smart meter, what do you want to explain to the people that everything would be under control? So, again, are you prepared to communicate and to report to the media?
That's a very good question, because I think, kind of going back to some of the presentations, I think sort of the change in culture, the change in expectations. When I look at government, I think a lot of what we're doing in government technology systems today is a direct outcome of what we've all individually already gone through and accepted from a consumer model standpoint, right? And so when I speak at cloud conferences and people ask me, well, why is government going to the cloud now? We're doing open government. I always relate, when I started this job 20-some odd years ago, that was unheard of. But we all accepted free Gmail accounts and the end-user license that went along with that, and online banking, and bill paying online. And so I think we all went through this personal transformation, personal technology acceptance, and the risks associated with that. And I think we've all formed cultural and personal opinions about when those systems fail, which they always do at some point. There is no system that's perfect, and we've all experienced in our personal lives downtimes of our favorite online service that we wouldn't have wanted to happen, or our credit card company saying that your credit card's been, hacked by someone else. I think, to your point, the most important thing, and why it's not just about open data or cybersecurity, it's about open government, I think it goes back to the confidentiality and the trust piece. I think the public needs to feel like in a smart city, smart government, that there's a confidence the government is doing everything they reasonably can to protect the best interest of the population. But at the same time, the people I meet with, I don't think there's an unrealistic expectation. They think I'm always going to be successful. So what I do think they expect of me is an honest accountability for when we do fail, when we will. I mean, there will be failures of systems, and someday someone, will be successful in penetrating all the level of defenses. It'll be a large, embarrassing situation. But to be honest about that and to talk about what we learned from that and how we're going to address that going forward. Will there be accountability? Will I lose my job? Will things turn out badly? They might. But I think that's the journey we're all going through from a cyber standpoint. I mean, you can be a Luddite and say, I'm going to get rid of all my technology. That's the only risk-free approach to cybersecurity, is really to have no technology, to bury all your money in the backyard, to not do anything online, not to have a cell phone, not to have a Comcast triple play account like I do. I assume everyone knows the books I read on Amazon and the movies I watch. I mean, that's my assumption as a consumer, right? I don't really have this false expectation as a consumer that I really have any level of privacy. I don't mean to be negative, because I don't think it is negative. I think when you do a lot of things online and you see some of the examples given, I'm disappointed at times to find out how much of my personal information and shopping habits has been shared. But every time I swipe my credit card, I assume that's going in a database somewhere. I'm trusting as a consumer individually that those companies, for their own self-preservation interests, are doing the best they can, because I'll cancel my account with Amazon or Comcast or Visa if I don't think they're doing a good job. And I think that's sort of the social contract we have in government with the population as we try to be more efficient in using technology to make these smart cities. We do have to be thoughtful about how we build them, because people are going to say, wow, that's really like an obvious thing you should have done to protect the system. And I think if we make obvious mistakes, then we should be held accountable for the consequences. But I think if a nation-state attack takes down a system that we couldn't have anticipated, or we were penetrated from within, I think we just need to own that and be open about it and what we learned from that. So have we perfected our approach to that? I don't think so, but San Francisco has gone through a number of highly public, embarrassing security incidents over the past few years, and I think we've become better at really just sort of owning that and having a more honest dialogue with our users and population about what we're doing to make things better.
Time for one more question.
So is the one thing we do to make cities more resilient actually making us more vulnerable? This is a very scary note to end the conference. Can you say something about risk and benefit? Is there some method you use to figure out when the risks really outweigh the benefits? And how do you assess that?
I think we could ask that question now. So who here thinks they can quantify the value of smart cities? Okay. So who thinks they can quantify the risk associated with these technologies? So I guess the answer is we don't know. At this point.
Isn't there a smaller scale you can pose it piece by piece than saying a whole city?
You could. I mean, you're right. You could go through technology by technology or system by system that you're deploying, but it's still, I think, can be a challenging problem to still quantify that. But that's what you would like to know, right? Is the added value, something I'm willing? Am I willing to accept the increased risk for the added value that I'm getting from it, from either operational efficiency, saving money, having a more resilient city, things like that. And I think there's a lot of technologies you can make the case for that, that it would save you money, or you can use new information that you're getting in ways, change your habits to do things like use less energy, or ways of improving traffic, or other things like that. So you're right, you'd have to decompose the question to looking at this particular systems. But every time one of those systems is proposed, I think you would want to be able to answer those two questions.
Well, I think one way to address your question is first to dissociate, like it has already been told, to dissociate the critical systems, than other systems. I mean, if you want to distribute data about the public transportation, why not? I mean, there is no, probably not a high risk to do such things. But when you're dealing with critical infrastructures like electricity delivery, water treatment, things like this, probably you need to perform a very detailed risk assessment and then assess the threats and then assess the technologies and so on. So I think we need to dissociate what kind of usage or application of the smart city we're considering. That's the first point. And the second point, I think we try to also, all of us, propose the fact that we need to design from the start a resilient system, which means that, like Galen also writes on his slides, we need to assume from the start that there will be incidents, and so we need to put together a real defense in-depth approach, which means a multi-layer, and a layer could be not only technologies but also people. It could be process, procedures. I mean, and so on.
Right. I like Pascal says he likes to look at the good side of things, so I'll go along with that as well and say yes, you can manage the risk. I think for new technologies, it's not insurmountable. It just needs to be, as Pascal said, part of that design process from the beginning of being able to make sure you have the right protections for managing your risk, but also the ability to manage incidents when they do occur. So.
And so I'll say this from a city standpoint, right? I actually, I think you just have to go into these things with your eyes open. I think technology has the benefit of making our lives much more luxurious, for lack of a better word, much more convenient, much more efficient, much more effective. I think it's hard to come up with an example. I was sitting here trying to think of the perfect storm cyber attack example that took down a large city or utility, and I couldn't come up with one, which is good news, right? And I think we worry about it a lot, but I couldn't come up with it. But we can all think of plenty of natural disasters that, whether it was Hurricane Katrina or the recent Hurricane Sandy. I was in Tokyo when the big 9.0 earthquake hit, and so if you look at those big natural disasters and the effect they have on the technology infrastructure, that would be the type of effect you'd be worried about, where everything's out of service. The phones don't work, land mobile radios don't work, the electricity's compromised, the trains aren't running, the water's not drinkable, all those things. That's what you worry about. You worry about someone's going to subvert the technology system and somehow turn that against you. I will say, having been in Tokyo when that happened, technology is actually what made things better in a disaster scenario. Is that even though a lot of the technology was compromised and that people were sleeping on the street, they couldn't get home and things like that, and that all of the technological conveniences that we wanted to use in Tokyo at the time weren't available to us, we still relied on technology, that resilient technology, to make our lives better. We were doing satellite uplinks, telling our families around the world we're okay. We're using Facebook, even though they kind of messed around with us with Beacon to tell us where we were and how to meet each other and sort of create sort of micro communities there. We were trying to interact in that way, and so even though technology was highly compromised, we still turned back to technology at the end of the day to help solve those problems. So I don't think. I think certainly there's a risk element to technology, but I think technology has become so embedded in our expectations of how we communicate with each other and how we operate as societies around the world. I don't think we should really see technology as the threat that's going to take us down as society. I think certainly pieces of technology are going to be at risk, and there's going to be times when they're penetrated. But I think at the end of the day, I think technology is still of a benefit to a smarter city initiative, to a vibrant society, and I think it should be supported.
That's a little more uplifting
Yes.
way to end this
Good
session.
way to end.
Okay, I think that's it. We're at time. I'd like to everybody thank the panelists. And I'll turn it over to Gabriel.
possible thanks to our host, Citrus. We've been greeted yesterday morning by its director, Paul Wright. It's now time for Citrus to let us go. So I'd like to welcome Hugh Aldridge, Director of Water and Cities at Citrus.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. I have the unenviable, maybe enviable task to be the person who says the last words you hear in this conference, but also I'm between you and lunch, so I will be very quick. First thing I want to do is thank Gabriel, who has masterminded this 2 days with some help from people like me, not much. Lots of help from my colleague Laurie Mariano, Thomas Deschamps from the Consulate, and Mary Perrine from Prime. I'd also like to thank EDF and the other sponsors for all their work and support of this conference. The second thing I wanted to say is thank all the speakers. I think it's been a fascinating 2 days. My overwhelming feeling is that we've just touched the surface of this topic. The first thing I wrote down here to say was, did we answer the question? So I'm going to say yes in part. And I think the way we answered the question was, we heard from 3 cities, and the 3 cities said they had problems. They said they had problems that they felt could be addressed by technology. I think the technologists we've heard said, yes, there are solutions, there are technological solutions. But one of the issues is, are we deploying them quickly enough to address things like climate change? Melanie Nutter said yesterday San Francisco could easily be swept away if the sea level rose. It's something, climate change I think drives a huge amount of what we need to do in the smart city. I think this last session was very interesting, but I think we don't have a choice. Some aspects of information technology sensors we need to protect us and to allow long-term planning for cities that are often built in the most silly places that you wouldn't build them. LA is not built in a very sensible place. It has no natural water. It has to get it up from up here. So, for those cities to survive, they need to plan, and plan very carefully. And I think the smart city technologies will help that happen. I think the other last point that I wanted to make, which I thought was very important, which is something Greg brought up, which is that this is what we really need are cyber-human systems where human beings are a huge part of the system, and that the technology helps those people be more engaged and more actively part of their cities. I think one of the things, as a citizen of a number of cities, I often felt that I was completely disengaged. You voted every 5 years, or every 4 years, or every 3 years, whatever it was, and then things seem to happen without you having any say in it. And I think Greg's point about the combination of resilient people and technology's role in helping those people be resilient, I think is where we need to be getting to. So thank you very much. I will not say any more. Thank you for coming to Citrus, and let's hope we can carry on this discussion and actually make a difference. Thanks very much.